This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Before my guest today, let me relay an experience. I always have these interesting experiences. Not that I'm anything special, but I attract interesting experiences. I gave a presentation recently. A small group, well-heeled investors, all worth over $1 million, 25, 30 people. I asked the group in advance before I spoke, I said, was anyone familiar with my style of trading, this trend-following quant style of trading? They were not. I drew no conclusion from that. Many people are not familiar with it, even people with lots of money. So I had no negative view or anything that I think untoward. I just said, okay, interesting. I know where I'm at with this particular group. I kind of have to start from the beginning as best as that I can in 45 minutes and walk them through trend following with story, graphs, charts, market charts, parables, you name it, real life examples, walk them through. And I did this over 45 minutes. Best that I could. I'm not perfect, but the best that I could. Many of the questions, and even one of the first questions, revolved around the issue of, now mind you, this was a group of well-heeled investors not familiar with a quant trend-following style of investing. The early questions, and many of the questions, well, I just don't have enough time. Now, I had posited that you could either be a trend-following trader for your own account, or you could hire a trend-following trader, something that I've said over the years many times. There's multiple choices on how you can do this. And some of the feedback was the questions after my presentation for 45 minutes, walking them through a very lengthy presentation. The question wasn't really even a question. It was just, I don't have time, or I don't understand this, or I really don't want to read, or I can't read a book right now. Smart people with money. You know, at that moment, you say to yourself, well, gee, why are they here? Why am I here? Right? Because the thing that I love to do, I love to be a curious guy. That's why this podcast of mine has developed. I want to be curious. I want to learn from my guests. I want them to teach me something that I don't know. And I just imagine myself being one of those investors in the room with this guy, Covel, in front of them, who has some insight about a subject that they don't yet have. Not saying they can't have it, they just did not yet have it. Why not ask the questions to take the education further? Why not dig deeper? Now, some people did. Some people asked legitimately good questions, but there was definitely some of that, I've got money in the bank and I'm a little arrogant right now. I guess I'm going to get that kind of thing, the more types of presentations and the more different types of groups that I speak to. But it was illuminating. So back to the point, one gentleman and a second gentleman said it as well, but the first gentleman that said it, I don't have the time, and do I have to read? Where do I get this information? Now, mind you, you should already be thinking, if someone's thrown at you a brand new topic of discovery in 45 minutes, go dig deeper. It's your responsibility. Look, if you don't do it, hey, there's no free lunches. I don't really care. I'm just imparting information. And as he went down this path, the only thing I could think to say at that moment, and I kind of cut him off at the end, was, this is not for you. Buy a mutual fund. And he just kind of looked at me with his mouth open like, he didn't say anything more. I was not trying to be an arrogant jerk. But to some degree, I think there's a certain amount of arrogance in the question. Mind you, the presentation had just completed 45 minutes. Now, someone might say, hey, Mike, you're being a little too sensitive. No, come on. I've taken enough slings and arrows. I'm used to that kind of stuff. But in the middle of a small group discussion, I want to move it forward. I want to have intellectual jousting, not feel sympathy for me because I don't have enough time to do what you've just told me about, Mike. So for me, it always comes back to curiosity. I love to be curious. My guest today is an insatiably curious woman, Harvard professor Sophia Roosth. I first heard about her talking about privacy and DNA privacy from some comments that came out of the most recent Davos conference in Switzerland. I said, wow, I must get this woman on my podcast. Her research focuses on the 20th and 21st century life sciences. Her first book manuscript, coming out this fall, examines how the life sciences are changing at the moment when researchers build new biological systems in order to investigate how biology works. She's asking in her new work, what happens to life as a conceptual category when experimentation and fabrication converge? Now that is fascinating. Just on the intro, if you're not curious, don't listen. If you're not curious, don't ask a question. To me personally, I just love to be a curious guy. I want curious guests on my podcast. That's how I run my life. I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Sophia. Hey, Sophia, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. I was just thinking, I was like, what a cool career path that you're on where you get to talk about the new cyber world order, de-extinction, the government swiping our DNA. You are right in the middle of all the fun stuff, bringing back the woolly mammoth. I'm so jealous.
Yeah, I've been having fun. It's a good place to be.
So let me ask you the big question. So I caught your line or some of your quotes, and I guess you were at Davos, yeah?
That's right.
Was that your first time there?
It was.
What was your impression? I'm curious. How was the event?
I mean, I had a blast. It was such a strange parallel universe. I'm not used to it. And my impression was that, academics at Davos are sort of, we're the garnish, I guess, on what's going on there. So, we're not the kind of major world players that tend to be attending Davos. And yet, I think the people who were there were interested in what we had to say. And yet there's so much technological optimism that gets attached to the Davos event. There's the sense that technology will fix the world's problems. So we get co-opted into that narrative in a really surprising way.
What was the surprising way for you?
So I come from a field where we take a much more, I want to say, thoughtful approach to technology, a recognition that technology can do good and can also do harm, and to be surrounded by people who are unrepentantly certain that technology will fix the world's woes was a bit of a surprise for me, to be honest.
You didn't see it. You didn't see the skepticism you would normally like to see in a discussion like this.
Perhaps that's the case, yeah. Even in the panel that I was in, someone asked a question toward the end where they asked, are you guys optimists or pessimists? And one of the other panelists from the law school said, well, we don't have to be optimists or pessimists. We're academics. We're just going to tell you what's going on. And I thought that was very apt. That's exactly the case. We're in this position where we can kind of we can account for what the history of technology has been, where it is. We can speculate a bit about where it's going, but at the same time, we're not going to claim that it's going to solve the problems that people hope it will.
I caught some of your lines. I think you were talking about privacy. Was that your presentation?
The whole panel was about privacy. It was about what becomes of privacy in a moment of internet surveillance. And most people talked about privacy in a different sense. I was more interested in the biological aspects of privacy because of the research that I do, but everyone was thinking about what it means to be a citizen whose privacy could be commodified because of certain forces in the cyber world.
You know, I want to dig into the biological privacy aspect, something near and dear to you. I should offer a little pearl of wisdom about myself. I've kind of learned over the last 10 years since my name first appeared on the internet that I like having my name out there because I actually feel like I have more privacy.
How so?
I feel like being out there, people will ask less questions. I mean, they're curious about what I do, et cetera, but I feel like there's almost you don't want to be the person that if they search for you, you don't have any search results coming up. You don't want to be the person that if they search for you, no pictures come up because the first naked picture that comes up will be the first one that shows up. Does that make sense?
So you're saying you've given enough talks that the naked photos show up on the second or third page of Google search?
I do think that there's something to be said, for at least from my experience, about having more information out there as a way to control privacy. It might seem counterintuitive, but I don't want to be the person that's caught. And I didn't plan this, but I don't want to be the person that's caught with no information out there. And then all of a sudden one negative thing is out there. And that's the only thing the world knows you by.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And one of the things that I talked about toward the end of my talk was the way some synthetic biologists have pushed back against biological surveillance by suggesting that the solution is radical transparency, right? If we all put all of our biological information online, then it ceases to be surprising. That's not privacy per se, but it is a way of defanging the specter of what it means to be in the public eye.
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk about biological privacy? You really see our DNA going down a path, and I'm putting words in your mouth, you can correct me, but do you see our DNA going down a path where it's a lot more public?
It is more public. So the thing that I'm interested in is why it's more public and what it means about us, because I'm invested in trying to decouple a humanistic sense of self from our DNA. I don't think that our genome is the sum total of, our annotated genome is the sum total of what we are. There's much more to who we are than what our genome might say about, our increased risk of Alzheimer's or breast cancer or who knows what. And yet, many people do think about genomic identity as being identity as is. As a result, the way people think about having our genomes online becomes a much more terrifying specter than it necessarily needs to be, which isn't to say that it isn't worrisome to know that that kind of information is in the public eye. And yet it doesn't, I think if people are educated in a way that they understand the limits of genomic information, then it's not necessarily as troubling as it might seem at first glance.
Let me ask you this, though, from a risk management standpoint, an insurance company standpoint, an MBA thinking standpoint. If I have that genome, whether or not my analysis is 100% accurate, I'm going to start to slot people. I'm going to start to supposedly mitigate my risk if there's financial decisions involved. Do you see that type of thing unfolding?
It's possible. I think that can be easily regulated. One example that I gave was GINA, which was a decision that was made by the U.S. Congress. It was described as the first human rights decision of the 21st century, which said that people would not be discriminated against on the basis of their genome. And obviously, there are many examples of how we have been able to protect people for many things, on the basis of ethnicity, heritage, sexual preference, what have you. And the genome doesn't have to be more or less. It doesn't have to be something that could disclose information about you that could be unprotected any more than any other information about you can be protected because of regulation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I look at the way information flows, whether it's our bank accounts, our health records, and I think we just all have to be prepared that it's all going to be out there. We have to be prepared for the worst case scenario. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, but I mean, what does it mean to prepare for the worst case scenario? What do we have to do?
Don't be surprised.
Oh, I'm surprised by very little these days.
Hey, let me slide into the notion. I don't know if it was attributed to you, but I would love for you to explain it. I think you were talking about a genetic McCarthyism.
Yeah, so that wasn't me. I was misquoted as declaring that we were at the dawn of an age of genetic McCarthyism. That was actually a quote that I was pulling from an op-ed piece that had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine around the time that Obama's genome was never posted online, but the story I told began with a stop that Obama made at a diner in Pennsylvania. In Scranton, Pennsylvania, in fact. What happened was this. Obama made a campaign stop at a diner in Scranton, Pennsylvania, ordered breakfast. So he had like a sausage, some waffles, a glass of orange juice, and he was hounded by reporters who were asking him about a recent meeting between Jimmy Carter and members of Hamas. Obama responded by saying, "Why can't I just eat my waffle?" That quickly went viral, both the quote and the waffle itself. What I mean is that the waffle got picked up by someone who then posted it on eBay, trying to sell it, saying that Obama's genome was still on the waffle and on the silverware. This event brought the possibility of genomic surveillance of politicians to bioethicists' attention. So two bioethicists, Georgia Ennis in particular, I don't remember who the second author was, published a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine where they kind of speculated on what this might mean at a moment where genetic sequencing and genetic synthesis had become fast enough and cheap enough that you could quickly sequence someone's genome off of silverware or a used coffee cup or a cigarette butt or gum or, any of the other bits of genetic detritus that we shed on a daily basis. This led the authors to declare that perhaps we were at the dawn of an age of genetic McCarthyism. I'm a bit more... Well, I'm not totally convinced by that. I don't think that we can talk about McCarthyism in the same way that McCarthyism was practiced during the Cold War, for example. But the anxiety that they were expressing was that there are certain aspects of ourselves that could be then used against us in the public sphere. And I understand that anxiety. And yet I don't want to claim that what we have entered into now is necessarily McCarthyism as it was practiced at the time.
Just so you know, as I brought that up, I realized that particular quote attributed to you seemed to bounce over in a lot of different publications. And I thought, where's the rest of the story? I'm getting this one line. I'm going to have to ask her because I wasn't confident my own self that this was accurately attributed to you because it became so useful. I actually saw it on some conspiracy sites and I was like, what's the real story here?
Yeah. You're being taken out of context.
I've got a friend, associate, who has appeared on my podcast. He's a fund manager, and his brother has gotten very involved in the cloning of champion cutter horses down in, and so involved that he's patented a certain technology for doing this process. I've actually been down there and seen it. It's quite amazing. And for example, like years back before they had the technology, he had one great horse they really loved and it was dying and then they saved it. And basically after it was dead, they came back and cloned it and all that fun stuff. And so now there's a huge issue down there with a registry and basically they're saying his type of cloning, even though in the registry are all types of other enhanced pregnancy type techniques that are used, but they're saying his type of cloning is just different because there's not necessarily a mother and a father. It's really interesting to see right there on the.
What sort of cloning is he using? Do you know?
Oh gosh, you know what? You're asking me on the spot, but I will email it to you. But it's terribly interesting, and he is very involved. I think you guys would actually have a fun conversation. But it struck me because I remember asking him, and here's a guy. He would probably not give you at the moment meeting him. You would not think that this man knows all that he knows, but he clearly is very, very wise to these issues. And I said, hey, as we have this whole walk around your farm, and we're looking at your techniques and whatnot. I said, I have a hard time imagining that this is not already occurring with humans somewhere. And he kind of looked at me and he said, well, it probably is. And that was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so I'm curious from your perspective, though, on the front lines, there are clearly people with pockets of money and scientific know-how. We don't know everything that's going on around this planet, do we, right now?
Certainly not. No, we don't. I have no evidence that that kind of technology is being used on people. This is something I teach in my classes. So I'm quite interested in somatic cell nuclear transfer, which is...
That's what he does.
Yeah, it's a $10 word for what other people would call cloning. And this is the technology that brought, for example, Dolly the sheep into existence. That technology has been used on a number of different species, and I write about interspecies somatic cell nuclear transfer as it's being used for the de-extinction project. But one of the things I find interesting about it is that it's not necessarily as novel as people think it is. I think that that kind of biotechnology, as it's being practiced for animal husbandry and agriculture, is really more on a continuum with all sorts of forms of breeding practices that are actually quite old. And I'm talking about the ways in which different kinds of sheep breeds and cow breeds have been developed to be of most use for humans, whether it's about meat or other kinds of byproducts, things like that. So what you see with technologies like Dolly the sheep is that the funding comes from similar places. The technology demonstrates a really tight coupling between biotechnology and agriculture. While the scale of the technology has changed because you're working on a molecular level, and the ability to control things at a cellular level is certainly novel, the ends of that technology are not. And since you brought up this case of your friend and one of the examples that I am really interested in is Chance and Second Chance. Have you heard the story of Chance and Second Chance?
No. The floor is yours.
All right. So there was a bull in Texas, a prize-winning bull named Chance. I actually once saw Chance because I'm from Texas, and Chance was a really big... Well, he was popular on the state fair circuit for a long time. Prize-winning bull, very friendly. Chance died. The owners of Chance decided to use somatic cell nuclear transfer to make another bull, a cloned bull, which they named Second Chance. This was done mostly with research and funding from Texas A&M, which is the agricultural university in Texas. Now, Second Chance was supposed to be genetically identical to Chance, but one of the things that people were most interested in with Chance was that he was such a charismatic animal. He was described as kind of loving and friendly and kind of engaged with humans. Second Chance was not at all, even went so far as to maul his owners on his birthday. And when they tried to talk about what that meant and what it said about genetic identity, the owner said, well, Second Chance is not quite like Chance, but maybe he's mellowing out. Maybe with age he'll be a little bit different. And they had a really hard time separating the identity of the two bulls, even though they're different organisms. While they might have similar genomes, they're not the same. They're not identical, and their behavior is going to be different. And yet that force of genomic identity, the way in which people think about genomes as cells, was so strong that they had a hard time reconciling what it meant for these animals to behave so differently from one another, that one was incredibly peaceful and one happened to be violent.
I think we all want to imagine that the cloning equals an exact copy.
Yeah, exactly.
Last year, the year before, I had Jack Horner on my podcast, and I saw him, a paleontologist, saw him speak in San Diego, and he was talking about his Chickasaurus they couldn't find the DNA. They couldn't clone. There's not enough tissue there's nothing to clone. So he was talking about the idea of bringing back a dinosaur by flipping the switches, letting the beak continue to grow teeth, not letting the wings fuse, not letting that tail stop growing, et cetera, et cetera. But why don't you talk about de-extinction from your perspective? The idea of a woolly mammoth coming back. I mean, you will be the queen of all 8-year-old boys. They will all just fall in love. If you, anyone that is talking about the notion that we will have a woolly mammoth come back. Now, how close are we actually to that?
Oh, not as close as people would like. And, when I talk about the woolly mammoth project or de-extinction in general, one of the first questions I always get after I present my material is, well, how soon can I have a woolly mammoth as a pet? And the answer is not terribly soon, because there are a lot of steps that have to be taken between what has been accomplished now and what it would mean to have a viable woolly mammoth. So the technology as it exists is based on some work that George Church at the Wyss Institute at Harvard has done. And what he's been able to do is, it's described as MAGE, which is multiplex automated genomic engineering. Basically, that's a way of making large-scale genomic changes in a very short period of time. So the idea is that they're going to be able to harvest genomes from woolly mammoths, then take those fragments of genetic material and copy them and paste them in such a way that you can get pretty close to an entire genome of an extinct woolly mammoth. And this is pretty complicated because, as you probably know, genomes degrade over time. That's why, for example, Jurassic Park is never going to happen. There's no way that you would have the kind of genetic material for a dinosaur that would be useful in engineering an entire dinosaur, right? Because of, for example, bacteria metabolizing genomes as they exist, the ways in which the genetic material just kind of decomposes over time. That being said, the idea is that they're going to take woolly mammoth genomes that have been preserved in ice, paste them together, and then compare those genomes to those of the closest living relative, which is the elephant, and then figure out what the differences are between elephant genomes and woolly mammoth genomes and paste in the bits of the genome that make a difference.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
You're going down this, as you call it, the biological time travel path, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but even once you do that, let's say you have an entire woolly mammoth genome, to the extent that you can even describe it as a woolly mammoth genome, then you need to perform interspecies somatic cell nuclear transfer in the same way that you would need to do for living species. So you would need to get that genome into the cell of something living, probably again an elephant. Then you would need to convince that egg to divide. Then you would need to be able to implant it in a surrogate. And woolly mammoths are way bigger than elephants. So the idea of having an elephant surrogate bring a woolly mammoth to term is like, I'd feel bad for that elephant. That would be a hard thing to do. Even once it's brought to term, then the question is, what do you do with a single woolly mammoth? I mean, you can't have one organism being an entire species, because species require multiple organisms to learn certain kinds of behavior and, learn how to move across large swaths of land, learn how they want to feed, learn how they want to reproduce. So one woolly mammoth isn't going to be enough.
Well, can't we clone the one, though?
You could clone the one, but what is that? I mean, maybe it's proof of concept. You'll stick it in a zoo, but it's not going to resurrect woolly mammoths as a species.
Okay, that's an interesting thought. So, clearly, this is your expertise.
Yeah.
But if we did get one back and we cloned one, and let's say we cloned 20, do we necessarily know what would happen? I mean, we really don't know, really. It would be the grand experiment that all of a sudden there's 20 cloned woolly mammoths from the one that we brought back. And now, how will life unfold unexpectedly?
Perhaps. The other thing that I would point out is that the environment, the ecology in which woolly mammoths lived and thrived no longer exists. So where are you going to put these woolly mammoths? What are they going to do? There's no climate that's going to be beneficial to them. There's no environment in which they will have other species, right? I mean, when you talk about an ecology, it's not a single species. It's multiple species, both plants and animals, and also microbes that are in some balance with one another. And that ecology no longer exists. It hasn't existed for thousands of years. So what do you do with these 20 woolly mammoths that have been taken out of their time and taken out of their place? They strike me as being not just proofs of concept, but kind of scientific demonstrations of what can be possible given the limits of biotechnical control. But they're not going to radically change what life on Earth looks like. In fact, I feel like their existence would be somewhat pathetic. And I mean that in the literal sense. You're
starting to go down the path of how we have to think about the ethics of all this too, of course.
Sure. Yeah. You could describe it as an ethical question. I think it's also an epistemological question. I don't mean to be overly academic about it, but when we're talking about taking elephant genomes and putting a few genes for woolly mammoths into those genomes, then the question arises as to whether that really is a woolly mammoth. And when I met with conservation biologists and synthetic biologists who were working on the de-extinction project, they would pose this question. The best way it was phrased was, well, if it looks like a passenger pigeon, so using another example, not of the woolly mammoth, but of the passenger pigeon, which is, using rock pigeon DNA to try to resurrect the passenger pigeon. If it looks like a passenger pigeon and it flocks like a passenger pigeon, then isn't it a passenger pigeon? And I find this a really striking question because of my training in history of biology. If you look at how species have been defined for a century now, they're defined primarily on the basis of their genetic material. And now we're talking about a radical redefinition of what counts as species on the basis of behavior and morphology, right? Something that has mostly the genome of an elephant or mostly the genome of a rock pigeon is going to be defined as a woolly mammoth or as a passenger pigeon because of what it looks like and how it may or may not behave. And that's very different from the way biology has been practiced over the last century.
You have tempered my fascination now, because now I'm thinking more in lines of Dr. Frankenstein with what will we exactly bring back. I'm thinking of Band-Aids and weird appendages that might end up showing up, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I was just watching the other day, or not watching, actually, yeah, watching and reading on King Tut. I mean, I had no earthly idea that King Tut was born of a brother and a sister and had a club foot and was basically a genetic mess. They didn't tell us that when that first came out as I was a kid, and they had Steve Martin singing songs, et cetera, et cetera. King Tut was this, brave warrior and all this other kind of stuff. Now you look at the whole Egyptian history and you're like, wow, this sounds like a backwards cult. It's all inbreeding and everyone's got massive genetic deformities, and you're like, wow. And I'm not trying to, if you're Egyptian, I'm not trying to pick on you or anything. I'm just saying, hey, this is history. This is what happened. Yeah. Hey, let me swing it back to one last thing I wanted to chat with you about that I saw on your Twitter. And it was just one tweet, but I would love for you to expand on it. And I think it was you. I was trying to make sure it was your quote. Will molecular gastronomy solve world hunger? Your answer, doubtful. First off, define molecular gastronomy, and then you can talk about why you said doubtful.
Sure. So this is another project that I've been working on for a while now. Molecular gastronomy it's a new social movement that has been founded by biochemists and chefs that seeks to reconfigure or redesign culinary practices on the basis of biochemistry. So the most famous proponent of this is Hervé Thys, who's a French chemist who works with a number of chefs like Pierre Gagnère. So the reason why I tweeted that was because there was a project that Thys and Gagnère engaged in, it was probably 4 years ago now, where they decided to concoct what they called the world's first synthetic dish. So this was a plate that they presented at a Hong Kong culinary conference in which every component was synthesized in a laboratory. So it's all chemicals, nothing actually grew in the ground, right? So a lot of people said it was. I didn't get a chance to taste it. I've eaten a lot of molecular gastronomy in my day, but I hadn't eaten this. I talked to Hervé Thys a lot about this because I was asking sort of what his end game was. Was this aesthetic? Was this a way of fetishizing science so that people could actually consume it? There are a lot of ways of explaining what molecular gastronomy is and why people are so invested or excited about it. One of the things he told me, and one of the things he said in his most recent book, which is what I was responding to, was that this was a solution for world hunger. If we can synthesize foods in a laboratory, then we can make sure that the majority of the world's population will have access to nutrition. I find that argument appealing. Certainly the intention is in the right place. It reminds me a lot of mid-century modernist ideas about, say, science fictional meals in a pill, right? None of us are going to actually have to eat food. We'll just take all of our necessary nutrients from some pill that we receive once a day. But that being said, the problem with the argument that Thys made, in my opinion, is that world hunger is not a technological problem. It's not something that can be solved in a laboratory. And the reason why I say this is because I think, well, I know that there is currently enough food being produced globally to feed the world's population. And not just to feed the world's population now, but to feed the world's population as it continues to expand over the next 5, 10, or 20 years. So the problem isn't about food production, it's about how that food gets distributed and the distinction between the haves and the have-nots.
Dictators and bad state actors don't help that process.
Yeah, I mean, dictators and bad actors would be the extreme. But if you look, for example, at the case of India, India has a grain surplus every year. They actually spend millions of dollars putting that grain in silos because they don't want to put it on the market. So in part, this is a problem of supply and demand, but what ends up happening, and we all know this, is that many citizens of India are malnourished, if not starving. And this isn't something that's going to be solved in a laboratory. Because there is a surplus of grain, this is really a problem of political economy. So the idea that we're going to just pour large amounts of funding into laboratory research in order to produce synthetic food strikes me as a bit naive, because there are solutions that have to do with the way that, trade happens on a transnational scale, the ways in which government is able to provide for the needs of its citizens. And that has nothing to do with science. And this is, coming from someone who studies the anthropology and history of science all day, I just don't think that this is something that science necessarily has to or needs to intervene into.
Sophia, you sober up all the headlines that want to make everything look easy and fun and cool. You sober us all up.
Sorry.
Hey, let me ask one last thing. I was trying to figure out whether I would ask you this first or last. You're on an elevator and it's like, hey, what do you do? Da 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 da. How do you define yourself? How do I classify you? Because your interest in your path and your studies, your research. I mean, you've got a really it's a niche, but it's also wide, and it's sometimes feels like, well, how do those parts connect? And how do you describe yourself?
Well, I can give you the long answer and the short answer. The long answer is I did my undergrad in cultural anthropology. I did my PhD at MIT in science studies, combining history and anthropology. I then did a postdoc in feminist science studies scholarship, and I'm now a professor in history of science. So I feel in many ways kind of disciplinarily promiscuous. I don't fall into any of those categories, and yet I like to think between them. But at the simplest level, what I care about is the fact that science is, by definition, a cultural endeavor. It's done by people who have particular kinds of stakes, who have investments, who have ideas about what science is, what progress is, what the future is, what counts as a species, what counts as life. I want to be able to unpack that from a cultural perspective. I think that kind of critique doesn't need to come from scientists themselves, nor is it the purview of journalists. And if I can get at that, no matter what disciplinary perspective I take, that's what makes me happy.
I love that explanation. I love the promiscuous explanation. I think I try to think of my podcast like that too. I just haven't used that word. Hey, where can people go to find out more about you? Where can we send them? You're working on a new book right now, or is it out? No.
My book is going to be out shortly. So it's going to be Chicago Press. The title is Synthetic: How Life Got Made. And I'm hoping to see it on shelves in September, October of this year. And then otherwise, just go to my faculty page. All of my articles are freely available online. Don't tell the publishers that, but they are. And I'm on Twitter as well.
I will circle back with you when the new book comes out. I would love to chat about it.
I'd love that as well.
Take care.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.